Hello again, everybody. Welcome back. I hope you had a wonderful Easter. I hope that everything went well for you, even though it was kind of a strange Easter. And I hope that your allergies aren't killing you like mine are right now, because there's clouds of pollen outside my window. We're getting back into my series that I've been doing about Bible study, how to do it, what are the best resources for it, what are some of the best techniques for doing it. And what I talked about last time, just by way of review, was two main philosophies of Bible translations. And one philosophy of Bible translation is a thought-for-thought translation. They take the original languages and then they think, what was the author intending to say through this passage? And then they translate that into English, thinking about what the author's intent was. This is an NLT, this is my example of a thought-for-thought translation. The other option was a word-for-word translation. And this is a translation where they look at the ancient languages again, and then they try to come up with the closest English word to represent the ancient Greek or ancient Hebrew that the author was using. And sometimes these can be a lot more complicated, a bit harder to understand because they're translating ancient languages to English, but you can pick up on a lot of nuances that you might miss otherwise. And my big summary from that lesson was that you should always have one of both of these translation philosophies. You should have one Bible that's from more of a thought-for-thought perspective, and one Bible that's more of a word-for-word perspective. So what I wanted to do today is to give you all a very practical, very hands-on sort of example of how this dynamic can play out in your individual Bible study and how you should approach it. What resources should you use? What's an example where the approaches of a thought-for-thought translation and a word-for-word translation overlap and intersect meaningfully? We ran into a perfect example of this in our youth Bible study the other week. We were going through the book of Colossians, specifically in Colossians chapter 2. Paul is talking about one of the main themes of this epistle as a whole, which is that Jesus is supreme over every other power, every other authority on earth and off of earth. So in verse 15, in the NLT, it renders it as saying, "In this way, he disarmed the spiritual rulers and authorities. He shamed them publicly by his victory over them on the cross." And that's a great translation, right? It's encouraging stuff. And it absolutely is a very good translation. That is a very valid thought-for-thought translation. That is what Paul meant to say in this passage. And if you're reading that, you are reading the Bible. The meaning is there, and it's understandable. So now let's look over at our word-for-word translation to see what we might pick up that we didn't get from the thought-for-thought translation. Here's that same verse, Colossians chapter 2, verse 15, translated in the NASB. Here's what they say. "He disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public example of them, triumphing over them in it." Now, the Romans had a very specific meaning for this word triumph. And remember that Paul was writing this in Rome, so he was surrounded by Romans at the time of writing. When a Roman legion would go out to a battle or to a conquest and they succeeded, when they came back to Rome, it was very common that they would have these giant parades. And these parades were called triumphs. The first thing to come into the city during one of these parades was the spoils of war, the stuff that the Romans took from the conquest. Then all the prisoners would follow after that, and then finally the army and the general that conquered and won this battle. And if there was one specific enemy that they defeated, like a particularly fierce Gaelic warlord or something, he would be singled out for extra mocking. He'd be covered in chains, they'd make him wear funny clothes, or maybe they'd parade him around naked, they'd jeer him, they'd put fake crowns on his head, sort of like what they did to Jesus. The crowds would throw fruit at him, everybody would be yelling at him and spitting at him. It was just this huge mockery of what had been defeated. And this parade and the mocking of the enemy that came along with it was called a triumph. So the point that Paul is making by using this word, triumph, is saying that Jesus, through his death on the cross and his resurrection, was making a mockery of the powers and authorities. By dying and coming back to life, Jesus is making fun of everything in the world that claims to have power, that claims to have authority. And it goes even deeper than that, because remember, Paul was in prison in Rome. The rulers and authorities of Rome had used their power, what they thought was power, to put Paul into prison. And now Paul is saying that through Jesus' death and resurrection, all powers, all authorities have been mocked. They've been triumphed over by Jesus. As the kids say, Paul was subtweeting Rome from inside their house. So, is the NLT translation bad because it misses this nuance or this thought? No, not at all. The NLT is totally accurate in the meaning of what Paul was saying. It's got his thoughts totally down, which makes sense because it's a thought-for-thought translation. But when we take a look at a word-for-word translation, we get another layer of meaning that helps us to more fully understand the text. So as you can see from that example, the strengths of the NLT cover for the weaknesses of the NASB, and the strengths of the NASB cover for the weaknesses of the NLT. And that is why for serious Bible study, you will always want one representative of a thought-for-thought translation philosophy and one representative of a word-for-word translation philosophy. So the natural next question is, what do I do if I only have one Bible? How do I know which one is closer to the original language? Do I have to know that weird triumbabadabado word? Like, do I have to learn Greek to understand the New Testament? No. But that is what we will talk about on Friday, additional resources that you can use in your Bible study time and ways that you can access them for cheap or better yet, free. So, hope you've enjoyed this. Have a great week. Don't die in the clouds of pollen. Adios.